Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Troy Clayton, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Warrant Officer Class 2 Diane Mason. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We also acknowledge the members of the RSL Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria, and RSL Queensland, who are watching this ceremony broadcast across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors to the memorial. If you're able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem. Thank you. If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Corporal Charles Vince Carr. Charles Carr, known as Charlie, was born on the 1st of March 1894 to Albert and Eliza Carr of New South Wales. Like his father, he was born in Bathurst, where his father worked as a cabman, driving a hackney cab. Charlie was educated at the Bathurst Public School and went on to work as a labourer. When he was 13 years old, he fell from a crate trolley at the Bathurst Iceworks, breaking his arm and cutting his face. The family later moved to Parramatta, where Albert continued to work as a cabman, and Charlie's grandfather Vince, after whom he was named, worked as proprietor of the Red Cow Inn. Charlie was a member of the Cumberland Brass Band and did 3 years training in the local regiment of the Citizens Militia. Charlie Carr enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force in September 1914, a few weeks after the outbreak of the war. He underwent a period of training in Australia before leaving for active service overseas with the 13th Battalion on the 22nd of December 1914. He later described the voyage as like going over to Manly. The voyage was so smooth, with hardly a ripple on the water. Private Carr was first sent to Egypt, where he trained in the desert camps outside of Cairo. He was particularly impressed to see the artillery firing at practice targets, writing, "It would surprise you to hear the shells whistling overhead. They could not have given us a better illustration of warfare than what they did." Unfortunately, like some soldiers, he contracted venereal disease while in Cairo. He was put into detention and isolation camp at Abysia and sent home to Australia on the 26th of May 1915. He was confined to the camp hospital for venereal disease in Langwarrin, Victoria, along with hundreds of other soldiers sent home. After being discharged from Langwarrin in August 1915, Carr returned to Seymour Camp, where he continued training until he was fit to return to the AIF. He left Australia for the second time to return to the 13th Battalion on the 3rd of May 1916, first travelling to Egypt and then on to England, before joining his unit in France in October 1916. Private Carr arrived in France at the onset of what would become the coldest winter in northern France in more than 40 years. He remained with his battalion for weeks as it rotated in and out of the freezing cold front line. By late January, Carr had succumbed to influenza and was suffering from asthma and an eye infection. He was taken to hospital for treatment. The winter was relatively quiet on the Western Front, with each side preferring to wait out the cold weather rather than to try to continue the attack in adverse conditions. Carr returned to his battalion after a week in hospital and a few days later took part in a raid on a German trench near Gerdecourt. It was probably Carr's first experience of offensive operations on the Western Front, and he found it shocking. Writing to his mother, he described having a mate killed at his side by a high explosive shell. He described the small-scale raid as the hardest fighting in the history of this battalion. Within days, Carr was back in hospital, suffering from asthma and an eye infection. He rejoined his battalion in mid-February. Shortly afterwards, the German army began withdrawing to the Hindenburg Line. Carr's battalion was involved in chasing up the retreating enemy, and on the 11th of April 1917 conducted an attack on the Hindenburg Line. The operation was a disaster. The supporting tanks were unable to reach the front line in most cases, and the 13th Battalion was one of several forced back by German machine gun fire. Carr came through the operation without being hit, and performed so well that he was promoted to temporary corporal that day, confirmed in the rank several months later. In August, Carr was again obliged to have treatment for venereal disease. Instead of being sent home, however, he was sent between a number of different hospitals and base depots in France. After 11 months, he was well enough to return to the front, doing so in mid-July 1918. 2 weeks after Carr got back to the 13th Battalion, it took part in the Battle of Amiens, the massive operation which launched the Allied offensive that would ultimately lead to the end of the war. The Battle of Amiens was a success, with the Australian Corps taking kilometres of ground and even more captured by the Canadians on their flanks. The German commander, Erich Ludendorff, later described it as the Black Day of the German army. That success came at a cost. Among the many wounded was Corporal Carr, who was evacuated from the battlefield with shell wounds to his left eye and left arm. He died on the 12th of August, shortly after reaching hospital in Boulogne. Today he lies in Tarlington, British Cemetery at Vermille, on the northern outskirts of Boulogne. He was 25 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Corporal Charles Vince Carr, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemned. In the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We'll remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrubber Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We'd like to thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.